right now we're going to start talking about the Great Depression, which is the end 1929 and actually goes through about 1945, some say into 46. First off, let me clear this up. The Great Depression the New Deal does not fix the Great Depression, so don't fall for that trap. And we'll explain why later on. The only thing that fixes the Great Depression is World War II and getting money bought and people paying for stuff, because after all, war does create money, unfortunately. Now, the first thing we're going to talk about here is the election of 1928. Remember 1920, we have Harding, he's pretty horrible, dies. We have Coolidge. Coolidge was kind of okay, I guess, but really didn't do much. And there, laissez-faire, hands off. We get our third conservative president in a row, in Herbert Hoover. But first off, I want to look at the election of 1928. Three things come up out of election of 1928, and those issues are prohibition. We have the issue of religion, mainly with Al Smith, and lastly, we have what are we going to do with this kind of world economy that we're going into. So there we have that. Now, Al Smith is the worst smeared candidate in U.S. history. They smeared him so bad that I don't think he could win a local election after 1928. And why did they smear him so badly? Number one, he's a Catholic. And Herbert Hoover's camp went and portrayed him as actually going to this man, the Pope, before he made a decision, which violates the Establishment Clause in the First Amendment, which says you can't establish a religion. And so a lot of people were fearful of this. However, 32 years later, we elect a Catholic, John F. Kennedy. When Mitt Romney ran in 2012, again, religion came up because of him being a Mormon. So religion plays a role here, but in 1928, they're afraid of Al Smith because of being a Catholic, and he wanted to do away with prohibition. He thought that people should be allowed to drink. He was a wet candidate, not a dry. And so for that reason, he will not win. So there we have prohibition. Now, going back to this, the man who does win is Herbert Hoover. His vice president, Charles Curtis. Irrelevant, I guess. Now, Herbert Hoover was the same man in World War I who had the Food Administration. He also, in the time we talked about with Harding, is a Secretary of Commerce. So he has a lot of experience under his belt, and people think he's going to do it. First off, not related to the vacuum guy, so don't go there. Now, Herbert Hoover, again, is conservative, so he's going to be laissez-faire. He's going to try to help businesses more than anything else, and that actually kind of hurts him in the end. Now, when here we have a quote by him, and then we'll get into this, right? We were challenged with a peacetime choice between the American system of rugged individualism and a European philosophy of diametrically opposed doctrines of paternalism and static socialism. The big quote there is rugged individualism. His speech in 1928 he calls rugged individualism. The way of thinking about that is he was explaining, I am not going to push the envelope and help people out through social programs. I'm not going to have paternalism. I'm not going to be your paternal father. I'm not going to promote socialism. You're going to have to figure it out on your own, and that is rugged individualism. That later comes back to bite him a little bit. Again, rugged individualism, conservative, he's a member of the Republican Party, as most conservatives are, and we start using the term GOP. GOP stands for Grand Old Party. How that's related to Republicans, I couldn't tell you, but it is, all right? Now, people wanted everything in the 1920s. They wanted a car, they wanted a refrigerator, they wanted all these things, and they can't afford them. So much like Kmart or anything like that, they had a kind of a layaway thing. It's called an installment plan. Because if I gave you the option to walk into Best Buy and buy a TV, and they had this little box there for you, do you want to pay for it now or later? You're going to check later because, in theory, most people don't want to pay for it up front. We'd rather pay for it later on. Now, this runs into a problem because what happens later if you don't have the money? But we'll get into that. But an installment plan and the way people were buying consumer electronics and consumer goods in this time is maybe foreshadowing the Great Depression. And so I like to talk about that at the beginning. So an installment plan is where you buy a consumer product, like a car or a refrigerator at this time, on low monthly payments. Okay? Now, Herbert Hoover's idea of rugged individualism goes into trickle-down economics. Trickle-down economics, how we're told it works, they use this bottle of wine. It fills the top glass. When that glass is full, it goes into the next two, and that goes into the bottom three. The idea is that top glass would be a business. So the government begins to pour in tax breaks and subsidies and all kinds of good stuff to the businesses, who in turn help out banks, things like that. And then finally, it gets down to the people. That's how trickle-down economics is supposed to work. Some people have actually said how it actually happens is you fill the glass, and the glass gets replaced with bigger glass, and eventually, nobody gets anything. So trickle-down economics is the idea of helping businesses and banks over the individual consumer, because they think that once the business and banks have received everything they need, they will pass on the incentives, a la installment plan, etc. All right, and so as I said, it has something to do with taxes. Now, with all this money freed up by businesses, they could begin to lower whether people could get involved with them or not. And they went into the stock market. The stock market's been around for many, many years. It's actually, as I said earlier on a place called Wall Street, which when it was settled by the Dutch, actually had a wall, which is why it's called Wall Street. And so what happens here is that the stock market, they exchange, buy and sell, trade, etc., shares in companies. And the idea is you want to get in on the ground floor, find a good one, and make some money. It's a little bit like gambling because you have a risk. Now the problem is, in our market today, the stock market is highly controlled. But in the 1920s, much like everything else, conservatives said, laissez-faire, let them figure it out, let them do what they want. And that leads us into some problems. Now in the next little thing, we'll talk about this. So right here, I want you to be able to tell me about the dirty politics election of 1928. Why did they smear Al Smith? And I want you to tell me the conservative theory of rugged individualism. How might that be a bad thing? Next thing is we're going to look at the bad stock market practices of the 1920s.